Guys, we're gonna do that twice. Here we go, but it'll be shorter this time.
I won't say anything.
I know, right? Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for chapters 9 and 10 of The Righteous Mind, where we're going to talk about our propensity for groupishness despite our individualism and selfish ways, right? And also looking at this really interesting thing that Jonathan Haidt talks about called the hive switch. I really enjoyed that chapter. We were talking a little bit earlier about how we really liked that hive chapter of chapter 10, but Bruce has some great pre-thoughts, and thanks for joining us today.
Hey, so I'm going to introduce chapter 9 about our groupishness by saying, and Bob Brewer and I were talking as we were coming online, that for me, that was the hardest chapter to read. And part of what made it so difficult to read was it was so scientific and working so hard to prove through evolution that we need each other and that groups are normal. And as a Christian, it was just kind of like, we could just say, hello, God is Trinity, 3 in 1, relationship, group. God created us in God's image. We are intended to live our lives in community and interdependence, in mutual submission, in mutual loving to each other. That's what it means to be human. And we could have said that in like one page and moved on and said, okay, all Christians were in agreement. God intended us to live our lives in groups. But he's working really hard to convince atheists, agnostics, people who have no faith foundation to say, let me show you biologically and let me show you based on evolution why we tend to need groups and all. So I felt like he was working way too hard, kind of plowing into this to try to convince us of something that any Christian theologian would just start with that as a foundational statement. Hello, if you're alive and you're human, God intended you for community. That's just the way you're created. It's who God is, all that kind of thing. So I thought of, by the way, this week in my devotions, I'm reading in Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, when he wants to rebuild the walls in the Hebrew scriptures, he begins dividing them into work groups and teams. And he says, okay, I want everybody from this village to work on that part of the wall, and everybody from that village work on this part of the wall. And those of you who live in this neighborhood band together and you work on the part of the wall. And those of you that are all interrelated and you're part of all this tribe, you all work to, and it was just like, it was so obvious that he knows the way you motivate the workers is that they care about each other and their groupishness. This is my tribe, and we're working side by side by my people that I know that we're from the same village, from the same family, from whatever it is. It's like we can even go back in the Hebrew scriptures and say, God intended the Hebrew nation as a nation. Abraham, I'm going to bless you and turn you into a tribe. And your tribe will become one of the nations of the world. Here's your assignment. As a tribe, as a nation, I want you to be my priesthood people. I want you to be a people of prayer, of holiness, of gathering for worship. Here are some of the tribal signals I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you circumcision. I'm going to give you holidays like Passover and the Feast of Booths and Yom Kippur. And I'm going to give you food regulations. If you're a Hebrew, you eat kosher food and all of this kind of thing is God's way of saying, I want you to all be a group, okay? We're Hebrews. What makes us distinctive? We believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We follow the commandments of Moses. We eat certain kinds of foods, dress in certain kinds of clothing, all that kind of stuff. What's God doing? God's making them into a group, which then made me reflect on, did Jesus intend for Christians to be a separate group? Kind of, okay, I've already done this once in history, and I created a tribe and a nation called the Hebrew nation, and they have a history and a story that goes with their tribalism. They were once slaves in Egypt, and they wandered 40 years, and then they got the promised land, and I gave them this land as my gift. And just now, is that what Jesus is doing? So when we come to Jesus' Great Commission at the end of Matthew, when he's sending the Christians out, so I'm going to read it again. My question is, are we intended to be groupish like the Hebrew nation? Are we a replacement to the Hebrew nation? Are we intended to be a new tribe of people? Because In the early church, they called themselves, we are followers of the way. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Are there distinctive things about us that tell us this is my tribe? What are those distinctions that make us distinctive as Christians? So here's Jesus again. Matthew finishes chapter 28. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. As you are going, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So my question is, was the intent of that Great Commission, did Jesus mean to establish a new nation, a new tribe? Are we a new group that formed out of Hebrew culture and Hebrew people? Kind of, what was the intent here? What is this movement that Jesus is starting? So I'm curious what you think about that from the chapter on groupishness. Where is groupishness playing into our own faith as followers of Jesus?
Well, I think Jesus gave us example by demonstration. His ministry did begin as an individual, but then he introduced, or the scriptures tell us, one after another, the brothers Zebedee and the other brothers, he assembled a group himself. And those disciples did more than what one individual, even though Son of God, but he saw the value of having different men around him as representative of his core group.
Yeah, I agree, Larry. That's a good insight, is that he founds his movement just on, not on himself alone, but for 3 years he gathers a troop of 12 to experience life together, to share community together, to have their doubts and their curiosity together. He's doing something. He's building a new community from people who come from their Hebrew background. They've got enough foundation of scripture, but something new is starting to happen among the 12. So it appears he's setting up a new group. Other
Or
thoughts?
or I was going to say he's equipping them to lead their own new groups.
Right.
You know, just like he built this group of 12, right? He's sending them out and telling them to baptize. And you see that's like, oh, I am now founding a new group. And you can see that in the early churches, that the early churches were all small home fellowships. They were all the small groups. And just like as in the big churches, we say, you know, small group is really important. That's how we grow. That's how we maintain cohesiveness. So that was how I read that, is in light of what he had previously done over the last 3 years.
That's how I envisioned it too. He's not saying, okay, you 12 go. He's saying, go, individually out and spread the good news. Right.
Yeah, and if each of them, as they're going, one of the ways of understanding it, I purposely read it as a participle, Janet, you'll appreciate. It doesn't say go and make disciples. Go is not a commandment. Go is as you are going. Now here's the command: make disciples, teaching them, baptizing them. There's a bunch of participles there that mean in your ordinary lives, in the connections you already have, in your family connections, in your group connections, at the workplace, wherever you may be, at the same time, bring discipleship into it as a follower of Jesus. So I think he's creating a movement that is groupishness in its perspective, that invites us to make connections with others, share life in community with others, not just baptize Tom and then send him on his way, and then baptize Susan and send her on her way. But there's something, a movement requires some kind of groupishness, I think.
Some sort of identity. But it's interesting that there's a couple ways to take this. By the way, Bruce, I was going to ask you what translation you read, because you said as you are going instead of this NIV that I posted in your guys' chats where it says therefore go. And I would say it was in this last year that I was reading about this and someone explained it as you are going. And it was a big aha for me, because that isn't a separate go in our lives that the church tells you to do. That's apart from your job or family. It means as you are going with your current job, with your current family, in your current social circles, this is your job. So it's not a separate thing that we like to compartmentalize our evangelism with. And so that's so neat. I've ever since I read that, Bruce, I've said that the same way, that as you are going. But it's interesting you went back to the calling or the creation of Israel with Abraham, because God said then that you will be a light to all nations. There was this inclusive, like, you are a people now, but you're also going to be a light to all nations. And Jesus continues that in this commission where he says, I want you to make disciples of all nations. So there isn't an aim at specific groups. In fact, it's an aim at all groups, right? So that's very, very inclusive. But I was also reading this last week too, that one of the greatest practices, and it may have been in chapter 9 now, because I forget where I was listening, but one of the greatest practices of Christianity in our membership or in our groupishness is the act of baptism, which completely identifies you as a group that has been baptized. You identify with Jesus, and it's a ritual that you've gone through that separates you from everyone else. So it's interesting, the creating of group in a all-inclusive invitation to all humanity, that Jesus walks the line through, you know?
Yeah, and as Tom reminded us, larger churches constantly wrestle with how do we keep our people engaged in the appropriate groupishness of trusting relationships, vulnerability. How do we take a huge, thing and turn it into small groups of connection? So people are living their life in discipling relationships with each other and connected with each other. So part of the struggle, I think, of Christianity as it becomes a larger institution in history is that the largeness brings resources, but loses something in the process. It got me thinking, if God created us to be groupish, what are the advantages of small groups and what are the advantages of large group? Where does large group open up resource options and possibilities? Where does small group open up connections? Kind of, how do you see those balanced out? What are the values of each of those, particularly we as Christians? How do we practice groupishness in healthy, appropriate ways?
Well, I think there's also another way of looking at this, is that the commission to go out, and is not just let's form new groups. You're already part of groups. Let's be transformational, right? It's enhance the groups we're already part of, not necessarily establish a whole new group, but we've already got family circles, we've already got work circles, we've already got community circles. Let's transform those, and so that those groups then can also follow the way, not necessarily create this big super group, even though, as you mentioned, Bruce, the bigger groups also provide some resources and some help, but they also bring a cost.
Yes, I totally agree with that, Tom. That's a great insight. Other comments on that, kind of where is the balance of small group and large group, and how do we do that in healthy, appropriate ways? Because we've all probably seen meltdown of groups that got unhealthy and it turned toxic, and just groups can be a negative experience for some people. Large groups can be that way, small groups can be that way. Janet?
I remember when I first attended RBCPC back in 1983, our friends said, who introduced us, who took us there, said, now this is a big church. If you join, you need to join some small group. And they didn't necessarily mean a Bible study small group, but as I recall, my years at RBCPC, between, whether it was the Sunday school team, or it was the women's retreats, or it was being an elder or on the costume committee for the youth musicals, I was always part of a smaller group where you made those intimate connections. And yet I loved the big church on Sunday morning, with everybody standing and singing and that largeness feeling, but needed, and was glad I had the smaller groups. And even now in COVID, I have this group, and I have a book club, and I have my CWDW group, Christian Women Drinking Wine. Jenny, where'd you go? And so I have small groups that I'm part of to stay connected to people. Uncommon Good, of course.
Yeah, and for me, that ties in with what Tom was reflecting on, that you can belong to a garden group, you can belong to the Rotary Club, you can belong to a parents' sports group, that your children are in a sporting group, whatever it is. In all of those groups, we can bring our discipleship of following Jesus, which then asks the question, what are the church small groups for? Kind of how do they recharge our batteries? Do they create a level of vulnerability, accountability? What is happening at a church group that is not happening at the garden club or at a book reading group or a library gathering or a sports gathering or whatever?
For me, we are part of a small group at our church, and allows us, to have a deeper dive, a little tighter connection in our church community, and then allows us to support each other in a lot of different ways, because our lives are all impacted in different ways, and we support each other. I think sometimes the bigger church doesn't quite see that part and can't provide that, versus a smaller group, we're there for each other, and kind of reinforces our faith and our walk in this together.
I'd agree with that. I'd also say that accountability is a part of it. When you're in a smaller group, you can help each other to remain accountable, and we're close enough in our small group that we'll call each other out if there's something going on.
Yeah, I think part of a church small group is we are offering each other mutual submission and saying, I'm not smart enough to run my life all by myself. I know myself well enough to know I'm blind to some areas. I have my failings. I have my tendencies that may not be healthy. So I'm inviting you into my life to help hold me accountable, to help me see my blind sides, to support me when I'm struggling with something, all of those kind of things that in my experience, I haven't found out in other groups, in Rotary Club or in other places. It's like, yeah, that's not what that group is about. So there is some intentionality that we offer each other something of more than accountability or vulnerability. We offer what I call mutual submission of, I will let you speak into my life because I respect you and I trust you. So there's an act of trust there. Other thoughts?
I think that goes along with some of the team building stuff that came out in the book and of stuff that we see. I also think that our groups are hierarchical, meaning we belong to more than one group, and some groups are more influential on us. So like you could have, your family group, if you've got a nice close family, could be up here, or it could be an awful family, but they still wield a lot of influence on you. So it would also be up here, whereas some things like working with a group, it just may be just down here. Yes, when you're with the group, you kind of act like with them, but when you leave the group, there's no residual. Whereas, as the higher the group up, there may be more residual that occurs. And some of the church groups can get closer to that, right? Because you're doing called a bonding type thing, like they mentioned in the book, whether it's a physical thing or a sharing or something that brings you up in that hierarchical.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, Tom, and it's off the top of my head. I'm wondering how much of personal investment becomes influential to me in other ways. That if I only give 1 hour a week to attend a Rotary meeting and sit, have breakfast with friends, listen to a guest speaker and go on with my life, there's not a whole lot of investment there yet. But if I'm at a church gathering and they say, hey, when you come to our church, We want more than just 1 hour on worship. If you're going to be transformed, it's going to take more investment of yourself into this process of discipleship. So we're going to invite you to be part of a small group, part of a Bible study, help the parents that are supporting the drama team make costumes and share your lives with each other. So it strikes me, the more that I'm willing to invest of my time and energy, the likelier it is that that group will begin impacting me in my moral understandings, in my opinions, in my politics, whatever it may be. That's a theory I have. Does that seem to play out? Does that resonate?
It struck something else in me, is that I wonder if, going into groups, you still start out as the selfish me, and that you're probably still playing that role in the group until your selfish me gets something. And that may start to trigger the switch. That's like, oh, wait, this is beneficial to me. And once it triggers the switch, then you want to be beneficial to the rest because you want the group to succeed. And so I think, yeah, investment of time, but also I think there's getting something from it, because that's usually what causes you to invest that time.
Yeah. Yeah. As Christians, I bet if we ask people, how did you come to this church? There is some moment where I liked it. I found people that made me feel comfortable. I did this, but I think you're right, Tom. There comes a moment where it went from the church that I attend to my church. Somewhere along the way, I felt personally invested and engaged. And that's what Jesus is inviting us to do, is invest enough of yourself that you're growing as my disciples. And here's my promise to you, you will be transformed in this process, because your life will become enlarged, your sense of purpose and who you are, what your calling is, and that you'll be challenged. I want the world to be a better place because I'm a follower of Jesus. Any other thoughts?
Bruce, I had a question. As a group leader, you've been instrumental in helping groups to mature in their commitment to Christ and commitment to the church in large. Could you share some thoughts about how you've seen successes, say with new members that come into the congregation, that you would introduce to a group of some of your more established congregation, and times when you've seen that become really productive in the growth of individuals' lives?
Yeah, I think it comes down to trust. And part of trust, we walk this delicate balance of groupishness that chapter 9 invites us to engage. And that is, to some extent, a group I'm going to feel invested in and that I trust has to be enough like me that I'm comfortable in it, that I trust these other group members and I'm willing to submit my life to these other group members. And at the same time, part of what church is church is challenging us beyond our comfort zones into levels of diversity that people may not always see it the same way we see it. And people will ask us hard questions, or they come from a different age category, or they've got a different background and life experience. So we're constantly in leadership balancing out, how do I pull together this group that has enough in common that I think it's a setup for success, and yet I don't want it to be so cohesive that it just becomes this little elite closed-in group that is unhealthy and that is no longer, healthy for the larger process. So I constantly struggled with that when Ryan started to put together groups of the same age. Like, we're all young parents, we're all in this age category, we've got kids, we're trying to figure out, what does life mean as a parent with kids? And so we have enough in common that we can use a curriculum, form small groups, engage in these conversations, but we're not inviting 90-year-olds to join that group, and we're not inviting teenagers to join that group. It's like, you need to have enough cohesion that the group is set up for success. So in a certain way, Jana, I'm almost jealous of you as a teacher, because I think teachers have enough in commonness in their classroom setting that they can form groups among their students and set it up for success. That the students, here's what we're asking you to do. We're asking you to work on your math problem. Now, around your table, we want you to, well, what do they have in common? They're the same age, They're in the same school. They're probably from pretty similar socioeconomic backgrounds. We've set up a success group experience for them, as we already know they have those things in common. Churches try to do something more challenging than that, but there are times I envy that. Like there's a cohesiveness there.
Well, and there's a danger in the groupishness that we've seen, you know, especially I think in the churches, that to go back to the starting with the Great Commission, that the more we foster groupishness, the more we're actually the enemy of the commission that goes into all nations. Because we say, okay, now that you've gone to the Sunday hour, we do want you to get more plugged in. Come to these groups. Let's change your social circles and surround you with the people that go to these groups. And now we've removed you from the world. We've removed you from the nations. And now really you're just a disciple of us and the Christians around you. And there's an interesting, there's a paradox to the groupishness, right? The more you go out and create groups, it takes a pouring of your energy to create an identity of a group. And you pour all of that into your identity of the group, and really you've removed yourself from the world that way. And that's that kind of the inner focus of church programs or highly programmatic churches, you know, that we've all experienced and been a part of and led, that you end up removing yourself from the world. And it's a strange thing about groupishness and the good of it, and yet the bad of it too.
Yeah, that's really important. I remember being let down and sad when I read a study that said when a new convert comes into a church, within 5 years of their engagement in that church, if they really get involved in discipleship and all of that, they will lose most of their former non-Christian friends. They will become less engaged in other groups that they used to be part of, that the church just sucks them out of the world and says, come, be with us, be more with us, be more with us. So I used to do a really counterintuitive thing with each new member class. Near the end of new members, and maybe this is part of Larry's question, at the end of a new member class, I would say, we want to help you find who God created you to be. Because God has gifted you, God has given you a unique personality, a skill set. You are you, and you are wonderful, and God has something, a purpose in mind for you. Now, here's my challenge. If you're not careful, we will turn you into a church addict, and we will ask you to just start spending all your time, all your energy, all your resources with us at the church. Please don't let that happen. If you have an opportunity to use your skill set, if you have an opportunity to use your giftedness somewhere out in the world beyond the church, always choose that. Always use it out there. Be engaged out there in the world. Be a disciple of Jesus in your workplace, in your friendships, in it. Use it out there. The world needs it out there. We're going to do fine at the church. So don't imagine we're trying to suck you into this and just lock you in and turn you into a cult member. That's not our goal at all. We want you to experience transformation and then take that transformation back out, because God wants you out there doing those amazing things that we can be doing. So every time I gave that talk, there was almost a sadness in me, like, I wonder how many people are really going to hear this and follow it, and how many are going to become unintentional cult followers of what we do well. Jana.
Well, I almost get emotional here. I do get emotional hearing you say that. And I'm right here. I heard that message after my new member class. And honestly, it made such an impact on my faith and my personal relationship with Jesus, because at church, I was so starstruck by all of you and the missions that you went on. I mean, you did these gigantic things, and it really inspired me, but I lost focus of what I do every day as a teacher. And I thought to myself, I got to do this. I want to go to Mexico. I want to go to Africa. Like I just was so inspired by seeing all that I completely lost sight of what I had in front of me every day. And it was that speech Bruce. It was that speech where I thought, oh my gosh, this is my skill set. This is the opportunity that I am given every single day. And it completely changed the way that I looked at teaching.
Jana, I am like emotional right now. That is so huge to me because that's what I was all about. I mean, if anybody would say, tell us what your pastorate was about, that was a huge part of what it was like. I promise you transformation if you invest here, but I don't need transformation just so you become a better church member. So Jana, thank you for sharing that. I so appreciate that. That is huge. So here's what I do want to say. If that's the goal of our faith, Jesus is sending us out into the world, then where is that hive switch a part of our Christianity? Because I wrestled with chapter 9 and just like, yeah, I'm struggling here. And in chapter 9, like the light turned back on for me again. And I got to chapter 10. And it was like, okay, I love this stuff because I see it all the time. I see it at sporting events. There is that hive moment where the crowd becomes united, chanting, and just the wave going around the stadium. And we're part of something bigger than ourselves because the home team just scored and, you know, all of that dynamic. And I see those hive switches that happen in church settings as well. I'll give you a quick one. Candlelight service, Christmas Eve. Everybody has their candle lit. And the pastor says in front, let's all lift our candles on the last verse of Silent Night. And the hive goes into full-on buzz. I mean, it's like we are all in the same space. We are part of something bigger than each individual in that room that just happened in that moment. Mm-hmm. I'm going to tell you what I said to Jeannie McCoy. She can't make it. And she said, please be sure it's recorded and Ryan posts it and all that. But I said to Jeannie, I think, Jeannie, we unintentionally discovered the hive switch in contemporary music, that there were those amazing moments when the music beat was there, when the clapping was there, when the swaying was there, when we were, it was like we lost ourselves for a moment. And it was no longer Jana and Bruce and Ryan and Tom. And all of a sudden, we became something else. We became an organism that had a life of its own that was way bigger than any of us. And I could feel the swell of emotion. That was like that. It was the spiritual moment that would keep me going for another week. It was like, I got to go back out to the world. I got to be part of that group. I need to take Jesus with me to my workplace. But man, something just happened today. And I used to call it, there is a Holy Spirit power that happens when that hive moment happens that I don't know how to describe to anybody. Well, he described it in the book and said, have you ever been walking in nature and you suddenly have that awesome realization, like the trees and I are one with each other and it's beautiful and this is incredible. And it's like we experience it with awe, we experience it in worship, we experience it in holiday moments. So what is that hive switch? Talk to me about that, because I think it's a big part of our Christianity. I actually, when I got done reading this chapter, thought, I don't think that my Christianity would hold up if I didn't have hive moments that keep me plugged in with God, that there is something gathering. And boy, COVID-19 killed the hive switch. And we're all trying to figure out, how do we get back to the hive? How do we need those moments? So beyond church or with church, tell me about hive switch moments in your life. When have you experienced that where it was suddenly bigger than you and you are part of something that became a new organism in that moment? Thoughts on that?
Definitely. It's definitely related to that. I mean, often with music things it's happened, but it's also something about, like I was just, when I was reading that chapter, thinking about all these kinds of moments, even going back to, in high school, I did drama and the rituals that we would do before going on for opening night. And it's those things where, there's a connection, and it almost doesn't matter because that was a very small group often. And then I've had, been at women's retreats where there's hundreds of us and all singing together. And those experiences just happen, like he described, that ritual of it is part of it, I think.
Yeah, there's something in that ritual.
I think that's part of why, especially in like Reformed traditions, we recite the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed and the Lord's Prayer, because it's, yes, it's a representation of our theology and what we believe, but it's also that practice of everyone coming together and sharing in something that we've been saying for thousands of years all around the world, bigger than our congregation wherever we are.
Yeah, I think music often does it. Reciting things do it. Other examples of that where you've experienced that?
I think also some physicalness does it. So one of the choirs I sang in, we sang by holding hands, and we were practicing and stuff. Yeah, we were kind of part of a group. Yeah, it was, do a dress rehearsal was great, but when we were actually performing and holding hands, you could just feel us all connected, and yes, there's some physical pieces about why you'd hold hands and what it does, but the feeling you got from that was just totally connected. You felt like you were one organism.
Yeah, in fact, there's a retreat group that puts on Christian retreats. And one of the things they teach their retreatants to do is when you're coming forward for communion, put your hand on the shoulder of the person in front of you. And just let's become one long chain of connection with each other, because there's just something in touch and muscle that reminds us that we are connected, and making that connection more physical. I've heard people talk about attending like a U2 concert and saying something happened in the moment. We all started singing the closing song together, and we shifted. Just, here's Bono up in front leading the concert, and it felt like God entered the auditorium, and suddenly it was bigger than us.
Part of that laying on of hands when we commission people. I know personally, when I was ordained as an elder, the group, it was an experience that's hard to describe. It was so much bigger than just having people stand around me. That feeling that now I can even channel just by holding up my hand, because I felt that when they were closer.
Yeah, remember when we used to do services sometimes and we were praying for something, I'd say, everybody hold your hand forward. Let's all press into this, and let's all put our hands forward and be part of this blessing or this moment or this healing. I personally think, I used to say, and until I read this book, I didn't totally get it, that there are waves of healing that happen within a congregation that I've never been able to figure out the curves and the waves, and why does it come and go, and why do we sometimes have a series of healings over 2 or 3 weeks? Now that I've read about the hive switch, I think it was connected to the hive switch. There's something bigger than us. We all became something bigger, and individual illnesses, problems, whatever, suddenly sloughed off in a miracle moment of, I'm part of something bigger than me. Why am I so worried about my little issue, whatever it may be, and kind of leaving it behind in transformation? I don't totally. Now, let me ask you the manipulative question. Are there dangers with a hive switch? If somebody knows how that hive switch works from a psychological viewpoint, could it be abused? And I'll give you a quick example. Our son, who has since become an atheist, walked away from everything, Christianity, all of that. But when he was in drama in college, a little bit similar to what you were saying, Jeanette, he came to the realization that the way he would watch church do the Lord's Prayer, he would gather the team around before they went on stage, backstage, and he would go, "Our Father," and they'd all chant, "Our Father, who art in heaven, who art in heaven," and he would turn it like into a chant to psych them all up, and they would all get like into this frenzy, and now we're ready to put on this amazing performance for the audience. And when he shared that with me, kind of made me uncomfortable. It's like, I don't think that's how Jesus intended the Lord's Prayer to be used. I think that's like manipulative. And I'll be honest here with my politics. I thought Trump was a master at that. he just was masterful in his ability to flip the hive switch at his gatherings. And when COVID kicked in and he could no longer flip the switch, it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same when they gathered and they emptied seats and they're saying, you have to wear your mask. And it's like, that's not how Trump does things. He's a hive switch person. He gets the psychology of flipping the switch and we all join in and become something bigger. So my question is, where's the danger of it? Do you see what I'm saying? That there could be a manipulative side of
You
the
just
hive
said
switch.
it. The
Okay.
danger was Trump.
Yeah, certainly
Right.
Trump is a master at that. Other thoughts that relate to that?
Well, history also does that. You see some of the very influential leaders who were clearly evil. I mean, yeah, I think that is very obvious.
There's an amazing museum in Nuremberg if you ever have this opportunity, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who's thought, how could Nazism happen with a Christian, educated, somewhat democratic country? I mean, how did that happen? And there's a wonderful museum that talks about, they used exactly those hive things, where they brought a lot of, we are the best and we are all the same in this way. And they also had that whole element, and these people are evil and therefore we will, put all of that on them. But it's absolutely was a use of that whole, the marching together and the singing together and the unity together. And it was very enlightening.
Yeah, there's a story about Robert E. Lee, that after the Civil War, he refused to ever march in step with anybody else again. Because he said, war is so awesome. You gather a bunch of young men and teach them all to march in step, and they all unite, and they will do anything, whether it's good or bad. They will follow anything. And he was so bothered by it, reflecting on his generalship in the Civil War, that he just made a different decision, said, I can't be part of that anymore. I just don't agree. That's too easy to manipulate and abuse.
Would you call
think
the January 6th insurrection a hive?
Good question. What do you all think? Was that a hive moment going on?
I believe it was.
Especially when you hear the interviews of people who participate in it a month or so later, they go, oh, I had no idea I was doing that. And that makes us think, go back to some old sci-fis. That was a Borg moment. They were not themselves. They were acting as part of an entirely different organism. And until they got away from that organism, didn't understand what it was.
I think it's unfortunate, but I believe it's true that we tend to take an easy way out. We allow somebody to explain a situation that may be very complex, but they'll give it a very simple explanation, and then lead into another more dangerous explanation, as I'm thinking about immigration policy and the election leading up, or the campaigns leading up to the 2016, and the amount of visceral energy that was in those rallies and groups for both candidates, as they allowed the groupish nature of our lack of individual responsibility was then replaced by a group responsibility or group response to different issues that we were facing. I think it's a very dangerous dynamic that comes out in a group. It can also be a very enlightening opportunity for those involved.
You kind of referenced that one of the dangers, that it's that great building unity within itself, but I think that some of these groups have taken it and not only built unity within ourselves, but same with the Nazis. I think Trump also had this going where he would then vihify another group, and then that's where I think it gets dangerous. It's not so much that our unity is bad, but that, and we as a group hate these people, or blame these people, or.
Yeah, it strikes me, Jeanette, that part of what the story of Jesus is in Holy Week is that the group hive moment of Palm Sunday, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, lay down the palm branches, all can turn right around 4 days later, and the same crowds in Jerusalem can be calling out, crucify, crucify. It shows, wow, what an awesome worship moment that was, that for a moment, everybody realized something new and different is happening in Jerusalem. This is the Messiah. And 5 days later, they're calling out for crucifixion, because that kind of group can go hive either direction, positive direction or negative direction. And so it's kind of a scary flip switch to be aware of. Other thoughts?
Oh, well,
There are a lot of people that would like to have somebody lead them, whatever it is. I mean, I think about Jim Jones and the Kool-Aid, and it's hard for me to understand how it got to that situation, but it did. It
could have started out very easy. I mean, that's kind of the danger of cults I was thinking of, is that they can start out, here's truth and hearing, let's build a group. And then once you've got the group, once you got the hive switch done, everybody belongs. Now you can really take it wherever you want, which is pretty scary.
I thought that was interesting that it's on page 277, but if you all remember where he talked about maybe the hive switch isn't so much of an on-off toggle as it is a slider. And when we get to the extremes of the slider, he points out a few things that can happen. Somewhere in between, we increase similarity and not diversity, which can be a good thing. But then you push that further, and what it does is it pushes for uniformity over unity. And it makes everyone, despite diversity, be uniform. And we know that that's an illness, right? So if the slider goes too far into the hive mentality, that's where I think we begin to drink the Kool-Aid, Ginny, right? And it's where he also says where we can exploit synchrony. We can exploit the marching together. And then we find that we could lead people in the marching together off of a cliff because the slider went so far. And it was fascinating to think of it that way, and the power. He then goes into transformational leadership in that section versus transactional leadership, which was fascinating. And it makes you realize the power of, when you're in an influential state, the power of where are you at on the slider, and constantly evaluating, are we in a healthy groupishness? That's helping people live a more complete life with healthy relationships, living into their best selves. Or are we in an unhealthy groupishness that is actually controlling and manipulating people? Even when we know the buttons to push and the right lights and the right songs. And so that was a really interesting place that he took the slider and went to transformational leadership.
Yeah, I like that too, because part of what he was reminding us was, if we're not careful and we are overly individualistic, and along comes a hive switch leader that can bring us together. Remember, he started chapter 9 with 9/11. He said 9/11 was so horrific for America that the hive switch flipped like that. And he said, I'm suddenly putting up posters and we're all waving flags and we're all and we want a leader to tell us we're going to be okay. And are we going to get back at the people that just attacked us? And what we need to stay sane is we need small groups within the large group that are diverse and have differing opinions, and we have checks and balances. And he makes the comment and says, one of the good things about the United States is our checks and balances of our small groups, that our groupishness is good because we can find groups that support diversity of views. And then we have a place for dialogue and difference and listening and humility and all of that. But there is a danger that hive switch can get flipped and turn the other group into the enemy, and we're right and they're wrong, and that goes toxic easily. Bob, you look like you have a thought.
Well, I have several. One of the things my dad used to say back in the 60s, he found it interesting that the nonconformists were the most conforming people. That, hey, the hippies are all have to dress a certain way. And then later on, you think about, he called them conforming nonconformists. And I see that you see this in the Black Lives Matter movement. You see this on the insurrection, January 6th. You see this, that things that may have started, you see it at Jim Jones, what Jenny was talking about, what may have started with some really positive ideas, if it gets perverted somehow, it can lead to death and worse, so it's, I think it's important to be around people. The accountability, I think, is very important, to be around people that you feel you trust enough that you can, that will say to you, are you sure? Are you sure you're not getting cultish here or whatever? I see this in the news. I have a hard time finding news that's not just directly political commentary. It used to be, I thought CNN was just middle of the road thing. I can't, now, I think Fox got its start trying to be fair and balanced. They've turned into just a right wing, such a right wing, and they're not right wing enough. So there's Newsmax and OAN, and then, then the other competition is CNN competing with MSNBC and all the other networks. And I find it interesting because I flip between all of them, and you hear the same argument, just different names on it. And I do worry about, I think we're Facebook and Twitter and Google are all in a dilemma situation, because I worry about them stopping people from their free speech because they don't like a certain opinion. But on the other hand, there's a certain amount of protection from totally false narratives. So it's a tough. There's many dilemmas it brings up. Anyway, I think that the thing that strikes me is the conforming nonconformists, and I've seen it all my life after my dad pointed it out. And I actually get a kick out of it because we all are, to a certain extent, conforming nonconformists.
So I had a youth leader that talked about that, the hive switchy piece. He obviously didn't use those terms. We called it mountaintop experiences. And he cautioned us about always seeking the mountaintop experience, and that we would not grow as Christians, and that we would be easier to lead astray. While having the mountaintop experiences are good, we were deemed to be part of the world and not always experiencing those mountaintop experiences. And I think, going back to what you were saying, Bob, is I think what we're seeing in all the news and the social media stuff is everybody trying to flip the hive switch. And if they keep flipping the hive switch enough, then we become, automatons on something. We're no longer thinking and no longer engaging in our other groups. We're spending too much time in the mountaintop experience, whatever it is, right? That we're losing kind of our self-identity and our ability to interact with our different groups.
Yeah, it strikes me, I had asked the question back in chapter 9 about small groups versus large groups. Large groups certainly have an advantage of multiple resources available to them. And so they can do some amazing things, like Jana says. Wow, they're sending people off to Africa. They've got mission teams going to Mexico. They're building homes. They're doing this, they're doing that. That's wonderful to share the large group resource. But we need small groups within the large group for counterbalancing opinions and saying, why are we going to Mexico? Is that really the best use of our resources? Should we be doing this? Should we be balancing this commitment with that commitment? And so healthy interaction from our subgroups is always a positive thing. So part of my takeaway today as we wind down is a reminder that, isn't it wonderful that Jesus put us into enough supportive settings with our groupishness that we can grow as disciples, and enough challenge within the church that we're all not just lockstep uniformist, but we listen to each other. We have to practice humility, love, invites us to pay attention to others who are different from us. So we live in that wonderful, challenging balance and dance of how do we enjoy groups and support groups and receive support from groups, and where do we feel challenged that we need accountability, we need other viewpoints to speak into our lives. So I love living in this place, but as Bob said, it certainly is a dilemma because it's not simply one or the other. Ryan, any closing thoughts for us as we wind down?
Sure, absolutely. The actually, and this is a perfect segue from what you just said, Bruce, is that there is a health that comes from groups. At the closing of chapter 10 on page 282, he says that recent research on social capital has demonstrated that bowling leagues, churches, and other kinds of groups and teams are crucial for the health of individuals and nations. And then he goes to an interesting place, though, right in the next chapter, which he wrote this far before pandemic and COVID. But he said that it is likely to be hungry for meaning when we're in a nation of individuals. And it is fascinating that during the last year, we have had to close off so many of our social groups that bring us health, bring us completeness relationally, spiritually, and mentally. And that this is a great time, I think, of a hunger for meaning that he wrote years before we even knew of what pandemic could do to its society and a globe. So that was an interesting thought, that as we can pour more into our circles, as we can reach out and be a healthy grouping for those that are isolated, that's bringing a little bit of heaven to earth right there. And then I'll close with this thought. He says in the summation of chapter 10, he starts off by saying that he used to believe that happiness came from within, a very Buddhist and Stoic philosophy that says you'll never make the world conform to your wishes, so focus on changing yourself and your desires. Just focus on the inside. But then it's fascinating. He says that, but by the time he finished writing, he had changed his mind. And he says that happiness comes from between self and between group. And he says it comes from getting the right relationships between yourself and others, yourself and your work, and yourself and something larger than yourself. And for anyone that has heard and gone through the Gospels, that may resonate a little bit with you, where it says, what did Jesus do in the years before? As a kid, he got lost and ended up at the temple, and then boom, he hit the scene at age 30. Like, what was Jesus doing the whole time? In Luke 2:52, it says that as Jesus grew, he grew in wisdom, mentally, he grew in stature, physically, and he also grew in favor with God and man. So in this place in between, it was almost a complete rephrasing of where Jonathan Haidt says, this is where happiness can come from if we grow in all these areas, which is between self and groups and the larger thing, which is a relationship with God. And I thought that was so fascinating to read for all of us as we lean further into the conclusion of the righteous mind. Oh, and then one more thing. Sorry, Bruce, lots of thoughts at the end, but the very concluding paragraph of chapter 10, the author, who right now is a pronounced atheist, I think he's an agnostic because he keeps searching throughout, actually, but he says it would be nice to believe that we humans were designed to love everyone unconditionally. In his heart, and in the heart of even the most pronounced atheists, we do see that there is a dream, there's an utmost goal to just love everyone, love unconditionally. And isn't that funny that is the heart of the gospel? And when Jesus was pressed the most on what is the most important thing, he said, love God and love others. And it's obviously in the heart of humanity. And so that was a neat God seed nugget at the end of chapter 10 to set us up for chapters 11 and 12.
Hey, I'll lead us in a closing prayer.
Thanks, Bruce.
Jesus, thank you for calling us into discipleship and transformation, into a life of purpose and joy, into the struggles of relationships that are sometimes testy and uncomfortable. And yet at the same time, we know we need accountability and honesty. We need vulnerability and trust. in this relational life you've put us into, where we live our lives in groups and in community, where we watch hive switch moments happen that lift us and elevate us. Thank you that you're the one who watches over us. Keep us in that sane, healthy place where we contribute to society and we receive your goodness and your love. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Thank you all. Woo!